All right. Thanks, Alyssa. Good morning, all. My name is Stephanie Erdis. Remember, I was here with you a couple times last week. I'm MCASA's Associate Director. So glad to be kicking off this week with you as well. Before we get started with today's session, I do want to do a little bit of an acknowledgement. So, in addition to Alyssa's sexual assault sensitive subject matter warning, I do want to just also mention we are going to be talking about underserved populations. So if you share some of the identities of the groups we're going to be talking about, if you've experienced oppression or discrimination, or you work for an organization that serves underserved survivors, we just want to spend a just special message to you to take care of yourself. Reminder that this is being recorded. So if you need to step away or you need to finish the session later, you will be able to do that. We're also going to have several points in the presentation where we're going to ask you to answer some questions in the chat and bring up some discussion. We know that we are not the only ones that have information on this topic in this space. So we want to take breaks every once in a while to let everyone share. Please share at whatever comfort level feels right for you. Don't feel like you have to share anything that would make you uncomfortable or that you're not ready to share at this time. This is all based on your comfort level and your experience. The last thing I want to say before we jump into today's learning objectives is Alyssa and I did not create this presentation. So normally, the folks that are presenting have created or edited the presentation. So Alyssa and I did go through and learn it. We've seen it multiple times, but I do want to acknowledge the folks that created and edited the training before us. So MCASA's former training specialist, Ariana Sessoms, originated the training, and then former USP policy advocates, Adam Casa, Chelsea Hood, and Leah Forney also refined the presentation. So we are building on their work. So I wanted to give them credit. I also wanted to announce that MCASA's new underserved populations policy advocate just began her work with us on Friday. So the next time we do this presentation, she will be presenting it. Her name is Emily. She's probably on the call today. So expect to see her name in emails and trainings in the future. We are super excited to have her on board. So, with that, let's get started talking about serving sexual assault survivors from underserved populations. So, in our learning objectives today, we're going to you'll be able to identify underserved populations who are impacted by sexual violence, describe how underserved populations are impacted by systematic oppression, and how trauma and inequality shapes access to sexual assault survivor support. And we're going to examine advocacy strategies using the socio-ecological model to promote survivor-centered, culturally responsive, and equitable services. So to give you a little breakdown of how today's session is going to go, we are going to talk about underserved populations. And I will say right off the bat, you're probably familiar with a lot of what we call protected populations. They're protected by law. But we really use this definition of underserved populations in a very broad way. So we are going to talk about all kinds of folks that may not receive adequate services or have barriers or face barriers to services around sexual assault. This will include incarcerated survivors. We're going to talk about oppression and trauma and how all that plays into it. Alyssa's going to talk about barriers to accessing services. And then we're really going to wrap up today with like moving forward. After we know what we know today, after we've had a chance to share with each other, what are some ways that we can really focus on equity in our services? So with that, just as a little icebreaker, if you want to put in the chat, if you had one advocacy superpower, what would it be and how would you use it? So I like this example here of instantly gaining trust. Um, I think my superpower would have to be, so please put in the chat to share. Um, One of the superpowers I would want is not when I started out as an advocate, I would want to not I would want to be able to sense when I was overwhelming the survivor with too much information. And I would use that to really pace what information I gave the survivor. I was often in direct services so excited about what we could help them with. I'm like, oh, we could really help them with this if they wanted it. And then I would just blast them with way too much information. So that would have been my superpower. Someone's just like eliminating, I like it, Teresa. You're like, I'm just gonna eliminate sexual assault. I love it. She's getting some hearts. And then we could all do something different. Uh, so excellent, 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 excellent. Protecting everyone, absolutely. Like a cloak of protection. I love it, Brenda. Good job. Always knowing the story so they didn't have to repeat it with prayer hands. Oh my gosh, that's a great one. Oh, these are excellent, excellent answers. To speak all languages fluently. Oh, Kenzie, I love that one. I wish I could do that too. Um, yeah, absolutely. To communicate with survivors from any background. That's a great one to get us started. Please feel free to put those in there. And what I will say is one of the things that's cool about this icebreaker is it helps us look at what we want to strengthen. So even though it won't be a superpower, but like how do we strengthen our language skills? It doesn't require us to learn every language. It might require us to really know the resources that are out there for that. How do we protect everyone? How do we strengthen our skills in safety planning? How do we really connect with and understand where survivors are at in that moment so that we can really pace ourselves? So this is a great way for us to get kicked off this morning. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa for us to start talking about and really digging into underserved populations this morning.
Thank you so much. All right. So, who do we mean when we talk about underserved populations? First of all sexual assault survivors are underserved. Sexual violence is 100% preventable, and yet it happens every single day. And all survivors experience barriers when trying to access justice or healing that they deserve. However, today we're going to talk a little bit more about some additional barriers or additional challenges that survivors may face due to their intersecting identities. And this may be because of cultural attitudes and beliefs about their identities. It could be because of an individual lack of awareness or understanding of their identities, or it could be because of systemic oppression impacting people who hold certain identities. Next slide. All right, so this is a select group of social identity descriptors, and this is by no means exhaustive. This also does not go in any particular order, but I am going to start in the top left corner to go over these. So starting with age. So this is one aspect of our identity, and in different cultures, people view age in different ways. For example, in some Asian cultures, elderly people are highly respected, cared for by their children. In some European cultures, however, elderly people are not as highly respected. They may be separated from younger generations if they're in assisted living facilities, for example. They may feel more isolated or lonely. Race. So this is a social construct typically based on skin color. So for example, Black, brown, multiracial, biracial, white. Ethnicity is someone's culture or shared heritage or language. So, for example, Latino or Latina or Afro-Caribbean. It's important to note with ethnicity that it's not necessarily tied to race and it's not necessarily tied to geography. Some examples of cultural communities that are not tied to race or geography include the Black community, the Jewish community, and the deaf community. Now, Black is a racial category, but it can also be considered an ethnicity. And Jewish is an ethnicity, but it can also have geographical ties. National origin is geographical. So this is where a person was born or raised or has cultural ties. National origin may include someone's country of birth, for example, Nigeria or Mexico. And it can also include a person's ancestral homeland or nationality, like Japanese or Australian. Examples of skin color may include light skin or dark skin or brown, etc. And skin color can also intersect with race. For example, someone can be black and dark-skinned or black and light-skinned. Someone can be Asian and light-skinned or Asian and dark-skinned. Someone can be albino with non-pigmented skin, but identify as black both racially and culturally. Ability or disability. So this encompasses a broad range of physical, sensory, cognitive, developmental, neurological, psychiatric, and invisible conditions that shape how individuals perceive the world, how they navigate the world systems, and how the world perceives them. For example, with physical disabilities, this may include mobility limitations like paralysis or chronic pain conditions like lupus. Sensory disabilities can include blindness or low vision. Intellectual and developmental disabilities may include things like Down syndrome or autism spectrum disorder. Cognitive disabilities may include things like traumatic brain injuries or dyslexia. Psychiatric disabilities may include things like schizophrenia or post-traumatic stress disorder. Neurological disabilities can include epilepsy or Parkinson's disease. And lastly, invisible or hidden disabilities. So these can be things like diabetes or long COVID or being hard of hearing. And that leads us into the next category of deaf or hard of hearing. So it's important to note with this category that some people who are deaf or hard of hearing may identify that as a disability and some may not. With faith, religion, and spirituality, so this can be a deeply personal aspect of someone's identity. It can be a huge aspect of their values and their beliefs and their connections to something greater than themselves. Gender identity is how someone expresses themselves to the world. So it's not necessarily tied to someone's sex assigned at birth. Some examples of gender can be a man or woman or transgender. It could be gender non-binary or gender non-conforming. And sexual and romantic orientation. So this is defined by the gender that a person is sexually and or romantically attracted to. So for example, someone may identify as lesbian or gay or bisexual or asexual or aromantic. Someone could be identifying as heterosexual. Socioeconomic status or class. So this involves a person's level of access to power, opportunities, and resources. And this is often influenced by a person's social environment, their job type, their income, and their level of education. Tribal or indigenous affiliation. So this is rooted in ancestral lineage, cultural heritage, and sovereign community belonging. It's also often connected to specific traditions, languages, and historical experiences. First language. So this is the language that someone learns to read, write, speak, or sign, or understand first. Immigration status. So this is when someone is a citizen of a country, a temporary or permanent resident, undocumented, an asylum seeker, or a refugee. And lastly, for this list, body size. So weight discrimination is important to consider here because it's often an ignored type of prejudice against individuals. For example, in 2013, Brigham Young University published a study which explored university students' biases against obese and non-obese female rape victims. The hypothesis was that obese female rape victims who sought help would be less likely to be believed compared to non-obese female rape victims who sought help. And in the study, participants were given several scenarios about acquaintances who engaged in sexual intercourse. And then the woman claimed it was rape while the man claimed it was consensual. In one scenario, the woman was obese and the man wasn't. In another scenario, the man was obese and the woman wasn't. And in the last scenario, neither person was obese. Study participants answered survey questions about which person's claim was most credible. And it was found that both male and female survey participants were less likely to believe the woman in the scenario when she was obese. So I think that really highlights how weight-based discrimination can influence or impact survivors when they're trying to seek help after a sexual assault. I also want to note that when we talk about all of these different types of identities that people hold, there is this added power and privilege dynamic that impacts people. And we'll talk a little bit more about power later in the presentation, but I wanted to briefly touch on this now as well. So within each identity grouping, there is a hierarchy of what is considered normal or the dominant identity in our society, and these hierarchies stem from our national and global histories. So these dominant identities are highly valued in our society. People with the dominant identities have more power and privilege when moving through different systems in our society compared to people who have more marginalized identities. So in the context of the United States, some examples of more of these dominant identities include being wealthy or Christian or able-bodied, athletically built, white, born in the US, or having access to a higher education. Now, I do want to note that someone may have one or more of these dominant identities and also simultaneously have more marginalized identities. For example, someone could be like a white heterosexual man and have an easier time navigating different systems in our society than a Black heterosexual man. So even though in that scenario, both men are, men and heterosexual, and those are the dominant identities, because white is the dominant identity in that racial category, that man will have a easier time navigating different systems in our society than the Black heterosexual man. It's also important to note that people who hold marginalized identities have been culturally, historically, systemically, and institutionally oppressed in our society. Some examples of people who hold more marginalized identities in the US are women and feminine identifying people, indigenous people or native people, people living in poverty, members of the LGBTQIA plus community, immigrants, Jewish people or people who hold a religion other than Christianity, dark-skinned people, and people with disabilities, and the list could go on, right? Ultimately, people who hold marginalized identities do not hold as much unearned power and privilege as people with these dominant identities. And this is solely because of the identities that they hold. Next slide. So I invite you to engage in the chat now. How do aspects of your identity show up when working with survivors from underserved populations? I can give an example while everyone's thinking. Maybe it's showing up. Oh, we got some examples already here. So how you communicate, the normalization of abuse, generational trauma, assumptions, language interpretation advocacy. Yeah, these are all really great. Anyone else? All right, well, we can move on to the next slide then, and feel free if anyone else has any ideas, you can pop those into the chat. All right, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about incarcerated survivors. So, if this woman walked through your agency's doors and said she was sexually assaulted, would you help her? You don't have to put this in the chat. You can just think about this to yourself. Would you help her? Next. What about now? If she walked through or if she told you she was sexually assaulted while in prison, would you help her? Next. What about him? If he walked through your doors and said he was sexually assaulted, would you help him? Next. And what about now? Would you believe him if he told you he was sexually assaulted while incarcerated? Would you help him? So I, that's awesome. I'm seeing a lot of yeses in the chat. So I'm going to launch a poll about inmates who experience sexual violence in prisons in the US. One second. All right. So the poll question is about how many inmates experience sexual violence in the United States each year. And I'm also putting this poll question in the chat for anyone who needs it there as well. All right, so it looks like the answers have slowed it down. So I'm going to end the poll. So it looks like the most popular answer that you all shared was 41,000 to 60,000. So about half of you put that answer. The next highest answer is 61,000 to 80,000. And then the next one after that was 20,000 to 40,000. So I'm going to end that poll. So according to one study published in the American Journal of Qualitative Research in 2025, about 80,000 inmates in the United States experience sexual violence each year. I'm going to go over a couple of more statistics to help us discuss this. So during 2024, a total of 16,178 Marylanders were incarcerated in state prisons, and 8,443 were incarcerated in local jails. And according to the Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services in 2024, there were 181 investigations of sexual misconduct at prisons and local jails, and 9 substantiated and 24 ongoing cases of inmate against inmate sexual misconduct. According to a 2019 to 2022 survey of 280 transgender people and their experiences in state prisons in the US, 53% of survey respondents reported being sexually assaulted during their prison term. 31% reported feeling unsafe due to being harassed, threatened, or attacked by other inmates. However, about 2/3 of survey respondents reported having access to outside advocates who helped and supported them. So ultimately, all survivors deserve support in their path to healing, regardless of the environment where the sexual violence occurred. So again, this is regardless of the crime that someone may have committed. Sexual violence and rape should never be a part of the punishment. The state takes on the care of inmates. And so part of that is providing a facility where they can live and work without experiencing sexual violence. Next slide. All right, so the Prison Rape Elimination Act, or PREA, was passed in 2003 with final standards issued in 2012. And this law establishes a zero tolerance policy for prison rape in the US. And PREA has multiple purposes. So in addition to that zero tolerance standard, it also works to make the prevention of prison rape a top priority in each prison system. It works to develop and implement national standards for the detection, prevention, reduction, and discipline of sexual violence when it occurs. It works to increase the available data and information on incidences of prison rape. It works to improve the management and administration of correctional facilities, to standardize the definitions used for collecting data on the incidences of prison rape, increase the accountability of prison officials who fail to detect, prevent, reduce, and punish prison rape. It works to protect the Eighth Amendment rights of federal, state, and local prisoners. And lastly, it works to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of federal expenditures through grant programs such as healthcare, mental health care, disease prevention, crime prevention, or investigation and prosecution, etc. Now, it's important to note that there are different sets of standards for different types of facilities, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Additionally, the responsibility to comply with PREA is with the facility, not with the outside community-based provider like a rape crisis center. So if a facility is audited and found to be out of compliance with PREA, it is the responsibility of the facility to take actionable change to become in compliance again. And facilities are audited every 2 to 3 years. Next slide. So again, when we can we go back a slide? Or one slide forward. Okay. So these are a couple of the PREA standards for advocates that are important to know. And if you go to the QR code here on the slide, this will take you to MCASA's PREA standards webpage, and you can follow along if you would like to. You can also go to mcasa.org and navigate to our PREA page that way, or with the link here at the bottom of the QR code. So a couple of key PREA standards to know. Standard 115.21. So this focuses on evidence collection and forensic medical exams. So this ensures that evidence is gathered effectively and that survivors receive proper medical care. Standard 115.53 ensures that inmates have access to confidential support services from outside organizations like rape crisis centers. Some other important standards to know include Standard 115.51. So this is focused on inmate reporting. And this standard says that inmates must have multiple internal ways to report sexual abuse or sexual harassment, and at least one option to report externally to a public or private entity or office that is not affiliated with the correctional agency. There's also Standard 115.82 related to accessing emergency medical and mental health services. So this standard says that agencies must provide timely, unimpeded access to crisis intervention services. And Standard 115.83. So this is related to ongoing medical and mental health care for sexual abuse victims. And this standard says that agencies must provide victimized inmates with follow-up services, treatment plans, and referrals for continued care. And again, you can read more about this with scanning the QR code or going to our website. Next slide. All right. So in Maryland, there are many relevant agencies. We have the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which is located in Cumberland. We also have the Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, and this is the department that runs our state prison system. We have the Department of Juvenile Services, which oversees juvenile facilities. We have the County Department of Corrections, which runs the local jails and detention centers in almost every county except for Baltimore City. And we have the local departments which run the lockups. So as previously mentioned, there are different PREA standards for different types of facilities. And federal law says that individual states stand to lose 5% of their federal funding for corrections if they do not comply with PREA. So some states have opted out altogether, and other states have certified that they will use the money to become compliant with PREA. It's also important to note that federal prisons typically house people after they have been convicted and typically house inmates that have sentences over a year and or felony convictions. Additionally, prisons are typically managed by federal or state governments, whereas jails typically house people waiting for trial or pre-conviction, or house people post-conviction that have shorter sentences. Jails can also house people awaiting transfer to another facility, and jails are typically managed by a county or city. Lockups are managed by local law enforcement, and it's usually for shorter periods of time, like 72 hours. So, for example, say someone is pulled over for driving under the influence, they may go to lockup for 72 hours or less. Community corrections are a bit harder to define, and community corrections or community confinement may look like, a community treatment center or halfway house or alcohol or drug rehabilitation center, or some other community correctional facility, including residential reentry centers. Typically, with community confinement, these individuals are there for part of their prison term. So this may be a condition of pretrial release or post-release supervision. Or these individuals may be there while participating in gainful employment, such as employment search efforts, community service, vocational training, treatment, educational programs, or some other similar facility-approved program during non-residential hours. And the main purpose of community confinement is that these individuals have to participate in getting a job, going back to school, or doing some approved program during non-residential hours. So again, in Maryland, there are many relevant agencies, but the main four are the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, the Department of Juvenile Services, and the County Department of Corrections. Immigration detention is managed by a federal agency, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. And when it comes to the standards of immigration detainees, that is a separate set of standards released by the Department of Homeland Security, but they're similar to PREA. Next slide. All right, so we're going to do this scenario, and I'll read it aloud and then invite you to share in the chat. So you are working with a survivor who is currently incarcerated. She identifies as a 30-year-old woman of color and part of the LGBTQIA+ community. She has been incarcerated for the past 5 years and has very limited access to outside resources. She has experienced sexual violence both before and during her time in prison. She's coming to you for support because she is feeling isolated and her trauma has worsened due to the prison environment. She is concerned about retaliation if she speaks out about the abuse that she's currently experiencing while she's incarcerated. So how would you provide immediate support to this survivor? You can think about short-term and or long-term needs. And I also want to acknowledge, I do see this question in the chat about opting out of PREA. I will send additional information in the follow-up email.
Well, Alyssa, I can add to that too. So, if a state facility is not compliant with PREA, they lose funding. So technically, a state facility can say, we don't want the funding. And then the kind of the best way to say it, if they if they opt to do that, it's not a lot of funding either. It's only like 5%, I think Alyssa said. Then the federal government doesn't have a lot of leverage to make them do something. Very few state facilities would be doing that. There may be certain parts of the PREA standards that they might not comply with and then not get funding. But most of them want and need the funding. And then for those that are not compliant, they can get the funding as long as they are moving it towards compliance. So that might help.
All right. So going back to the scenario, we've got some answers in the chat. So some people are saying they would link her to legal aid groups or crisis intervention and counseling, helping her to identify which resources are available, connecting her with LGBTQIA plus resources, provide her with a resource that she can access immediately, and then long-term goals based on her desires. Peer recovery services, if available, any trauma-specific groups in-house. Awesome. Let's see. I think the first immediate thing to do would be to support her, hear her out, let her know that it makes sense for her to feel this way. Yeah. Let her know there's support out there. Um, and that she has a network of help available to her. Yeah, these are all really great. All right, well, we can move on to the next slide. So MCASA has a PREA toolkit that's going to be coming soon in 2026. And this is a comprehensive toolkit designed to help correctional staff, advocates, and incarcerated individuals understand their rights, roles, and responsibilities under the PREA standards. So again, this is going to be launching in the coming months, and it will be sent to all correctional facilities in Maryland, and it will be available for both digital and print. Next slide. All right, and I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie for the next section.
Great. Thanks, Alyssa. And thanks for everyone who put information in the chat. The last thing I would mention about PREA is if you work in an area that has an incarceration facility or maybe getting an incarcerated facility, if you have questions about working with PREA or setting up an MOU or memorandum of understanding with the facility, getting those connections made or those documents in place so that you can better serve incarcerated survivors, please reach out to MCASA. We have technical assistance available. As Alyssa told you, we're working on these toolkits. So making sure that incarcerated survivors have the same access to healing services, legal services, and reporting services is really important to MCASA. So please reach out to us if we can help you. All right, so let's talk about intersectionality. So it's important to note that people are not a monolith. No one group is the same. Just because one person holds just one identity does not mean that they can speak for or would speak for that whole entire group. So some of you may be familiar with the term intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw, a lawyer and professor at the UCLA School of Law and the Columbia Law School, coined the term intersectionality in 1989 to describe the intersections of identities and power. She discussed how a Black man can experience discrimination because he is Black, and a white woman can experience discrimination because she is a woman. But a Black woman, however, can experience a different type of discrimination because she is both Black and a woman. The way her intersecting identities are threaded are threaded together, and how she's treated gives her a very different life experience than someone who does not experience both of those forms of discrimination at once. And so Kimberly Crenshaw gave the example of gender and race, but the intersection of our identities and power can be many different intersections. And the power associated with those identities impacts how we see the world, how the world sees us, and how we are treated. We also know there are populations that are underserved not because of identity, but because of circumstance. And Alyssa talked a little bit about this a few slides ago. So these might be things such as homelessness or suffering from addiction or for those that are incarcerated. Statistically, folks that are marginalized, that have marginalized identities, are more likely to be filtered into those circumstances. So, this conversation around identity is the framework for a lot of the conversations that we will have around underserved populations. Someone from an underserved population is someone who holds one or more identities that have been historically and are currently being oppressed. So let's move into our conversation about oppression. The best definition of oppression that we have heard is a perpetual state of disadvantage, not something you can pull up your bootstraps to get out of. Oppression is historically, systematically ingrained in our cultural beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. And it's often traumatic for those experiencing it. We'll talk a bit more about trauma in just a few minutes. How does oppression show up for survivors of sexual violence from an underserved population? So I want to give some examples. And for those of you that are currently working or have worked with survivors, especially survivors from underserved populations, some of this is going to sound very familiar. So, for an undocumented immigrant that is a survivor of sexual assault, they may fear deportation if they report being sexually assaulted or getting fired from their employer. Um, for a Black woman survivor, it can look like dismissing her pain or downplaying it under the ideology that she did something to cause her sexual assault. And as we know, sexual assault is never the survivor's fault. Historically, Black women have been seen as less vulnerable and or hypersexualized. So this may be the experience of a Black woman survivor. For an Indigenous two-spirited survivor, it can look like not receiving culturally competent services and dismissing their cultural beliefs. For an LGBTQ survivor, it could look like not respecting their gender expression or misgendering them that might further isolate the survivor. For disabled survivors, it could look like questioning whether they can be victims of sexual assault at all just because of their disability. It can look like being frequently denied access to proper health care and mental health services for incarcerated survivors. So one of the most important connections to make here is that oppression operates via systems of power. People who hold one or more dominant identities are given unearned power in society. People who hold one or more identities that are oppressed are rendered with less power or powerless. This is how hierarchies work. One group has power, the other group does not. This is so important to talk about when we do anti-sexual violence work because power operates the same way with sexual violence. This is power. Sexual violence is about power and control. For sexual assault survivors, their power is taken from them while the person who harmed them is seeking to gain power over them. Sexual violence is a power-based attack, just as racism, sexism, anti-LGBTQ, antagonism, and ableism are forms of power-based violence. This violence is used to perpetuate oppression of the targeted group. We know that anyone of any identity can be victimized by sexual violence, but we also know that folks who already hold an oppressed identity and are deemed powerless by a society are at the highest risk for being targeted. People with mental illness or who have a mental illness diagnosis, people who are transgender, people who are homeless, Indigenous people, children, all experience extremely high rates of sexual violence because they have less power. Their condition of having less power can be exploited. This is why, as advocates, when we are doing anti-sexual assault work, we are also doing anti-oppression work. We cannot eliminate sexual violence, when it is most often used historically and still today as a tool for social control, physical domination, and power to sustain oppression of oppressed groups and maintain power for the abuser. To get to the root of sexual violence, we must advocate for an equal and equitable society where power is shared. Part of this journey in eliminating our personal biases, expanding our personal and professional networks, and improving access to our institutions for oppressed people and enhance support for people that are marginalized within our institutions. So we have a graph for you on the next slide. So this is the 4 elements of oppression, and we're going to go through these and relate these to sexual violence. So these are kind of the 4 areas that contribute to oppression. This is not inclusive, but this gives us a visual way to think about it. So we're going to start with defined norms. So establishing what's considered a norm in society, and this can be harmful because it others people. So, for example, if white, cisgender, heterosexual, able bodied individuals are seen as the standard, survivors from communities that are not that can be perceived as deviant or deviating from the norm. And this can impact their credibility. So, survivors outside of the defined norm may be seen as less credible or less deserving of protection and support. And this is the opposite of what we want to do for sexual survivors that we're serving. These defined norms create harmful stereotypes, such as hypersexualization of Black women, or the invisibility or the erasure of LGBTQ survivors and their relationships. The next one we want to look at is institutional power. So not only do we have kind of defined norms as an element, but we want to look at how institutional power can impact survivors. So this is where you see systematic barriers. So you might see barriers in the legal system, the healthcare system, or social service institutions. They often favor those who align with the defined norms, and they marginalize others. Marginalized survivors may face bias in policing, courts, or HR systems that discriminate their claims. This lack of cultural humility in institutions often means there's a lack of resources and training to understand and support the specific needs of marginalized survivors. The next quadrant we're going to talk about is violence or threat of violence. So survivors that have oppressed identities or marginalized survivors experience higher rates of physical, sexual, emotional, and financial violence due to systematic racism, homophobia, transphobia, and ableism. They have a larger fear of retaliation from their abuser, or like we talked about, fear of deportation, fear of backlash from their community or their family. So their fear for retaliation or action taken after they report or seek services may be more enhanced than someone from a identity that is not or less oppressed. Other policies and racial profiling and other forms of violence that disproportionately impact marginalized communities are also part of this quadrant. So let's look at the last quadrant on this graph. And we're talking about economic power. And on Wednesday, we'll have a whole session about how important it is for survivors to have economic power and to have financial resources as part of their healing. So limited financial resources or lack of access to wealth and economic stability can affect and impact someone's ability to access resources or access justice. Marginalized survivors, particularly immigrants or low-income individuals, often face sexual exploitation and other forms of sexual violence, and they can be afraid to report these incidents at work due to fear of losing their job or deportation. Not being able to afford legal fees, bail, transportation to court are also all contributing factors in this economic power quadrant. And sometimes it can be lack of resources. So you learned about the Sexual Assault Legal Institute last week, which is free. But someone from a low income, an individual that is a sexual assault survivor that has low income may not know that they can seek those resources, or they may not have additional resources to seek them. They may not have adequate internet connection if they were supposed to do internet meetings. They may not have adequate transportation or childcare to attend meetings with the Sexual Assault Legal Institute. So it's important that they understand the resources that are available to them, and we'll talk more about those on Wednesday. So before we move into our next section, we have another think and share. So what are some of the forms of oppression that you have seen in your line of work? So as you've been working with survivors, how have you seen oppression show up in that work? One of the things that I have seen when I did direct services, so please put in the chat what you feel comfortable sharing. One of the things I saw are housing resources. Housing resources were really, really challenging for survivors, and sometimes this impacted most survivors that had low income or less resources. Even if they could find a place to go, they may not have the resources to physically move stuff. They may not have the resources to furnish an apartment or a living quarters. Many of them had been taken advantage of in their apartment complexes. So if they had low income, sometimes landlords would abuse that power and engage in sexual harassment and sexual assault that they felt like they could not report because they didn't want to lose their housing. So medical or mental health care, absolutely, I've seen that as well. Not having transportation. Alyssa and I are actually working on this project with a couple other staff at MCASA, and transportation continually comes up as a barrier or a place where we're seeing oppression as well. Excellent. Silencing due to rank in the military. That's a great one, Teresa. So one of the things that we want to think about when we think about underserved populations are like having a really large umbrella there. And there are folks in the military that are definitely underserved and definitely being silenced. I will say the Department of Defense has done a lot in my time as an advocate to really help in those areas, but there's still a ways to go. So thanks for bringing up that population. So let's talk about culture and trauma. We talked a little bit about trauma last week, but we want to continue that conversation, particularly as it relates to underserved populations. So you'll see this graphic on our screen here. And this rape culture pyramid is a graphic that we use often. So you may have seen it in some of our other presentations, or you will see it in the future. But it's a wonderfully done visual representation of the way in which oppression is the foundation of sexual violence. So if you look at the very bottom, some of those words that Alyssa and I were just using, transphobia, racism, sexism, ableism, they are the foundation for this rape culture. And we don't often connect them in our conversations. So this is a visual way to see that connection. The structural forms of oppression cultivate a society in which the attitudes, behaviors, and policies higher up on this pyramid become prevalent and pervasive. So you can see the terms at the bottom, like I was just talking about, are forming those building blocks for additional harmful behaviors and attitudes towards marginalized or towards minoritized populations. When it comes to sexual violence, prevention cannot be successful without addressing this structural oppression that's at the bottom. And we also have to consider the root of structural oppression in our work when we are doing direct services with survivors and navigating systems to support them. So one of the things when I was reviewing this slide that I thought of is in the center section, these are often things that can easily be dismissed, right? Flashing, voyeurism, catcalling, jokes that are inappropriate or about sexual violence, they fall in this middle category, right? And I had an experience when I was doing direct services. I was on a college campus and there were four women living in like a little suite apartment. And on their floor, there were four men living down the hall from them. And for the first couple weeks of the semester, these men had banged on their door late at night. They had written inappropriate and offensive language on their door. Like they had like a whiteboard. So it could be erased, but they were still writing these inappropriate things on their board. And then they would draw like male genitalia on their board, and the women were really getting fed up for this. And you can see where the sexism comes into play there. You can see where the rape jokes and the privilege and some other things on that second layer, like gender roles, are really coming into place. And then within those first couple weeks of the semester, there was a fire drill in the building. And these gentlemen you can see flashing there right in the middle, these women in this apartment. And they had had enough. They were like, we are done with this. We do not deserve to be treated this way. And they filed a sexual violence report on college campuses. Some of you might be familiar. It's called a Title IX report. And I met with these students as the advocate, and they were like, listen, we are not traumatized by this. We just want it to stop. We do not need to be treated this way. And I think, they were right. They were like, we don't want counseling. We don't need that. We feel really supportive and safe in all the other parts of this building. And the university, to appropriately, took this complaint through the full entire judicial system at the university. And these men were held accountable. They weren't removed from the campus, but they were removed from that building, and the four of them were no longer allowed to live together. And so it was just a great example on how things were building. And it got to the point of flashing, and people took charge and made sure that that was understood to be inappropriate. And then they didn't climb any further up in this pyramid. So I wanted to share that story with you this morning because I really think that you'll also look at this pyramid and see where there are different ways that we can intervene and different things that we can work on to make sure that we aren't getting to the top of this pyramid where we've got sexual assault and coercion and rape. And we can really start to work on these lower levels when we talk about things like sexual assault prevention. So I do want to talk about trauma, and trauma is a topic we've already gone over, but I want to refresh this in the sense of underserved populations. So these are the 5 types of trauma that we're going to go over, but just a reminder that trauma is emotional and physical harm resulting from violence, conflict, natural disasters, or societal structures. It's a normal response to an abnormal experience. Each survivor that you work with is going to react in a different way, their own way to trauma. And some signs that you can look for, but may not be present because everyone reacts differently, are they may have flashbacks, they may have symptoms of PTSD, they may have depression, anxiety, numbness, avoidance, hyperarousal, trauma may impact their sense of identity. So we've talked a lot about identity. So imagine experience trauma on top of experiencing oppression, and understand how that might impact someone's identity. You could see eating disorders, sleeping disorders, self-harm, or suicidal ideations or attempts. All of these are ways that trauma may manifest in a survivor. Or keep in mind, it might be none of these. There are several types of trauma, and like I said, I won't be going over all of them, but I do want to highlight these 5: collective, historic, transgenerational, cultural, and structural, and how these relate to underserved survivors and how they relate to oppression and identity. So collective trauma is trauma that impacts individuals or groups. So examples here might be colonization, gender-based violence, institutional racism, particularly having to do with police brutality on social media and having to see those incidents over and over. That's kind of a collective trauma that people can experience. Historic trauma is emotional and psychological wounds over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma. So some examples here might be slavery, genocide, apartheid, environmental degradation. All of those things can contribute to a historic trauma. And then adding on to that, we have transgenerational trauma. So there are studies that have found that trauma can be inherited, so transferred from one generation to the next. So a first generation trauma survivor can transfer trauma to a second and further generations or offspring. This is really considered like a complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And some examples are people that were descendants of Holocaust survivors were found to have physical symptoms of anxiety and trauma, including elevated heart rates. So, cultural trauma can occur when attempts are made to eradicate part or all of a people, of a culture or a people. Examples are the Holocaust, treatment of indigenous people, treatment of homophobic, the treatment of LGBTQ folks by people that are homophobic or transphobic. So things like conversion therapy can be a cultural trauma, white supremacy, trying to get people to assimilate to a certain culture, to leave behind their culture, genocide of people with uh, intellectual disabilities or autism. All of those are cultural trauma. It's trying to erase somebody's culture and the trauma that that can cause. Cultural practices that create, oh, I lost my place. Sorry. So examples here, like we gave some examples from it, but additional examples are female genital mutilation, toxic masculinity or machismo in cultures, or secrecy in family and churches can also contribute to cultural trauma. And the last one I want to talk about is structural trauma. So, trauma created by policies that result in unjust, abusive, racist, homophobic, or unsafe systems that cause hardships, often on a longer timeline or a continuous basis. So, examples here might be the prison industrial system, US policies abroad, effects of the economic system on different cultures. I'm reading a book called Yellowbird right now about it takes place on a reservation in South Dakota, and a part of the history of the book is talking about some of the land and treaties that were violated, the land capture and the treaties that were violated in the indigenous community, all the way up to the beginning and middle of the 20th century. So those are examples of structural trauma, continually having to move, continually having treaties violated, continually being pushed and forced into different smaller segments and reservations. So that was an example I was thinking of when I was reading that yesterday of structurally induced trauma. These traumas are important to keep in mind because when an individual survives a sexual assault, they may deal with this trauma after this event, and there may be other traumas that they have experienced that are triggered as a result of the sexual assault. If they are from an oppressed identity, they may already be living with cultural trauma or transgenerational trauma. And though this might seem unrelated to the assault to you, it may feel very compounding to them and continue to compound the traumas that have already impacted their life. So it may make navigating support systems or their ability to heal more complex. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa. So now that we've talked about identity, we've talked about oppression, we've talked about trauma, we want to talk about how this contributes to potential barriers and the access to support services for underserved populations.
Yes, thank you. So, as we've discussed, everyone's experience with trauma may be different. The way one person responds to trauma may be different than another person's response to trauma, and both responses are valid. Um, Survivors may experience barriers that prevent them from seeking help after a sexual assault. And these can be barriers that any survivor experiences, things like victim blaming, right? Shame and embarrassment. It could be a fear of not being believed or wanting to avoid the re-traumatization that may happen with engaging with the criminal legal system, or a fear of retaliation from the person who caused harm, right? So any survivor can experience those barriers. And over the next couple of slides, we're going to talk a little bit deeper about some additional barriers that someone from underserved populations may experience. Next slide. All right, so first we're going to do another think and share. So I invite you to engage in the chat. What are some barriers that may prevent a survivor with a marginalized identity from seeking services? All right, so let's take a look at the chat. So we've got a fear of not being believed, trust, language, yeah, a lack of awareness, maybe immigration is a factor, previous stigma, lack of trust in the system. Yeah, these are all really great. All right, so we can go on to the next slide, and you'll see some of these ones that you shared in the chat are also up here on the slide. So over the next couple of slides, I'm going to discuss barriers through two different lenses. We're going to look at the community level barriers, as well as barriers of what it may feel like when working with advocates. So starting on the left with the community barriers, this could be a lack of trust in systems. So again, this can be due to historical harm or systemic racism, maybe negative past experiences with institutions that may make survivors from underserved populations hesitant to engage. It could also be cultural insensitivity. So services may not be tailored to their unique experiences or language, as some of you mentioned, or cultural norms. So survivors may feel like they're being seen, but not necessarily understood. There's also stigma and shame. So in some communities, like for example, faith-based communities, there may be a silence around sexual violence or reproductive justice or reproductive coercion or mental health. So a survivor, may fear judgment from other community members, and that may outweigh their desire to seek help. There's also accessibility and visibility. So again, services may not be visible to survivors, or they may be hidden behind some extra barriers. Now they have to jump through these extra hoops to even access services. For example, with transportation or childcare or internet access. As an example, for rural communities, transportation can be a really significant limitation, especially if someone doesn't have access to their own personal vehicle. How are they going to then access different services, right? So when working with advocates, survivors from underserved populations may feel like these are some additional barriers that they experience. It could be performative allyship. So advocates may say all of the right words, then fail to act on them. And that can leave survivors of sexual violence feeling like advocates are more interested in checking boxes than building trust or rapport. So I do want to go over one way to address this could be recognizing the way that unearned privilege shows up, how it can inform thoughts and attitudes and behaviors, and practicing that self-awareness and learning from implicit biases. That way it doesn't get in the way of the work with the survivor. Another way to practice allyship is to continuously seek knowledge about different underserved populations while being aware that you can't ever know everything because it's impossible to know everything about everyone, right? So even if someone is from one community and you've researched that community, no two people are the same. No two people will experience the world the same. So just remembering that and recognizing that. And that leads me into the next point here about a lack of cultural humility. So survivors may feel like advocates don't understand the nuances of how trauma can show up differently in marginalized communities. And again, that can leave survivors feeling the burden of having to constantly justify or explain their reality. So, first of all, it's important to remember that trauma impacts everyone differently, right? As we've talked about, people can have all different kinds of trauma responses, and all of that is valid. Additionally, as mentioned before, it's important to continuously seek knowledge about different underserved populations. It's important to self-reflect on your assumptions and practice being comfortable with not knowing everything because it's impossible to know everything. And that leads me into the next point here with assumptions and biases. So, survivors from underserved populations may feel like advocates believe that everyone processes trauma the same way, or that there's this one size fits all approach to working with survivors. And that can make underserved populations or underserved survivors feel invisible and invalidated. And lastly, tokenization instead of inclusion. So survivors from underserved populations may feel like organizations want to work with them to check the diversity box. And that can send the message that their voices are present, but their power is not. Now, I want to share a quote from the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence's toolkit on best practices for engaging survivors of sexual assault from culturally specific communities. I think it really sums up this point really well. So the quote is, diversity is when you count the people. Inclusion is when the people count. And I'll share the link to that toolkit in the follow-up email today because they have some really great checklists and additional information on how both advocates and organizations can work to practice inclusion and checklists on what organizations can do to implement inclusive policies and practices. Next slide. All right. So this slide is about barriers that keep survivors from underserved populations from engaging in our services once they arrive at our organization's doors. So again, at the community level, this may look like stigma and shame. It could also be a distrust in the legal system. Again, it's important to remember that you represent the system. And so it's not personal if a survivor is struggling to work with you. It may be that historical harm from the system in a previous experience, and now you're representing the system. There's also cultural barriers. So secrecy within the household, what happens behind these doors stays behind these doors. Again, historical trauma, such as the unethical experimentation of people of color. There's also gender and sexual orientation stigmas. So this could be, for example, a fear of being misgendered by the advocate or by the organization, or inadequate healthcare systems. So healthcare professionals may not be trained on how to work with different survivors of underserved populations, and that can cause a lot of fear for underserved survivors. When taking a look at the advocate side of this list, some additional barriers may look like a lack of representation. So maybe when the survivor walks through your doors, they may not see advocates who look like them, and that could pose a barrier. There could also be economic disparities. So for example, survivors may need to decide whether they're going to go get help or they're going to continue to work to put a roof over their head. Or maybe they don't have childcare, and so that's a barrier in trying to go get help from you. There could also be institutional barriers. So a lack of proper procedures in place, or a fear of not being believed or facing retaliation if they go through the system and say something. Again, language barriers, which a lot of you mentioned as well. So if the survivor is a part of the deaf or hard of hearing community and uses American Sign Language, is there staff available that signs? Or are you able to easily access interpreters? Or if the survivor is Spanish speaking, do you have Spanish speaking staff available or easily accessible interpreters? For stereotypes, are you aware of your own implicit biases? Because if not, survivors from underserved populations may pick up on that. They may pick up on your biases or the stereotyping, and that can really impact your work with them. And lastly, for this list, a lack of trauma-informed care. So do you understand that trauma looks different for everybody, that there is not this one-size-fits-all approach? Next slide. All right, so these are some additional barriers that incarcerated survivors may face. So again, at the community level, there's stigma and blame. So Incarcerated survivors may face judgment and shame from their community for their criminal history, and that can make it a lot more difficult for them to be believed or supported as a survivor of sexual violence. There's also a mistrust in the justice system. So survivors who are incarcerated may have a deep mistrust of both the justice system and community resources. And that again can stem from past experiences of discrimination or mistreatment and lead to a reluctance in seeking help. There's also isolation and alienation. So incarcerated survivors are already isolated, right? They're already kind of alienated. And so then after experiencing sexual violence while incarcerated, they may further feel alienated or isolated because they have limited access already to support networks. Then there's the criminalization of victimhood. So incarcerated survivors are sometimes seen more as the perpetrators than as the victims. So their experiences as being sexually assaulted while in prison can be overlooked or minimized due to their criminal status. And then there's the cultural and family expectations. So survivors from certain cultural or familial backgrounds may feel pressure to feel silent about their abuse due to social norms or things that stigmatize victims. And then economic and social disconnection. So once released, survivors may struggle to reintegrate back into their communities due to a lack of support systems. And that can make it a lot harder, again, to receive care and healing after their sexual assault. And then taking a look at the advocate side. So this could be a lack of confidentiality. So survivors may fear that working with the advocate is not actually confidential. And that's particularly in the case of correctional environments. So they may fear that talking to the advocate can jeopardize their safety. There may also be limited access to advocacy services, and this can be due to limited access to outside advocates. There may be language and communication barriers. So again, survivors who are non-English speakers or who have disabilities or face other communication challenges may struggle to effectively engage with advocates, and that can further hinder their ability to share what's going on or experience some support. There could also be a fear of retaliation. So advocates may not be able to fully protect survivors from retaliation or punishment from other inmates or from prison staff. And again, that can make it difficult for the survivors to trust that working with the advocate will produce a positive outcome for them. And then there's cultural and racial disconnect. So advocates may not always be trained in sensitivity or understand the unique needs of incarcerated survivors. And again, that goes back to the point of it's important to continuously do this professional education, this training, so that way you become more aware while recognizing, you won't know everything, but just, remember, just trying to learn as much as you can. And then lastly, for this list, bureaucratic challenges. So the prison system's rigid structure and complex paperwork can slow down the advocacy process, and survivors may experience delays or denials when trying to access support that they need. So ultimately, it's important to know that incarceration inherently limits someone's freedom, and that can add to, even more complex barriers. Next slide. All right, so we have another think and share. So I invite you again to engage in the chat. What are some actionable steps that you can take to address some of the barriers that survivors from underserved populations face? So taking a look at the chat here, we've got partner with other organizations for advocacy, keeping a list of appropriate resources and language tools. Yeah. Being present and mindful. Yeah. advertisements on the walk or table that speaks to the issue. Oh, sorry, the wall. Yep. All right, great. Well, thank you all so much for participating. I think for the sake of time, we'll move on, but feel free to continue to engage in the chat.
Thanks, Alyssa. So for our last couple of slides and our last couple of minutes, we're going to talk about, I'll go back a slide, moving forward and considerations for serving, for service providers for serving sexual assault survivors from underserved populations. So we're going to start by looking at the socio-ecological model. For any of you that do prevention work, this might look familiar. It really comes out of the public health sector. But in this slide, we've really tried to apply it to serving underserved populations. So as you can see, this is a socio-ecological model. It's a way of looking at all of our levels of influence: individual, interpersonal, sometimes called relationship, organizational, community, and public policy. So discrimination, oppression, and microaggressions can show up in any of these circles. So we want to do a little bit of a deeper dive in what these circles mean. And as you reflect on making your work more inclusive to people of all identities, consider each one of these levels. And many times we get stuck in this individual level because that's the level where we have the most control, like how we act. But I also want you to think about the other levels and to work to make structural change in the systems that you might be working in as well. So we'll start with the individual level, but we're really going to expand out from there. So the individual level is about our knowledge and our attitudes and our skills. So this is what like I said, where we have the most control. So you want to avoid things at this interpersonal level, like assumptions, which Alyssa just talked about, and being aware of our own implicit bias, and not assuming and not don't assume you don't have a certain community in your service area. So an example of this is sometimes people assume that LGBTQ folks only live in rural spaces. But as we know, many LGBTQ folks live in rural spaces. And so for those of you that are serving rural communities, you want to make sure that you are considering all the folks that may live in your community and not make assumptions about who lives there. Having multiple resources prepared in case the survivor wants different options. So what are you doing at that individual level to enhance the resources that you offer? You want to validate all identities that are coming through your door. You don't want to ask personal questions that aren't pertinent to that person's situation just because you're trying to learn about their identity. It's never anybody's responsibility, and especially the responsibility of a survivor, to teach you about their identity. You need to find that information in other places. So you want to prepare for survivors to be frustrated with the system at this level, and you are part of the system, so they may be frustrated for you. So be prepared to work through that. So let's look at this interpersonal level, sometimes called the relationship level. So this is your ability to build stronger relationships, whether that's with other resources that serve sexual assault survivors or serve underserved populations. And maybe you building relationships with the people that you are working with. So you want to read, watch, and listen to the marginalized voices. You want to get involved in your community events. So where is your organization going when they're doing outreach? Are they going to events where underserved populations are? Are they trying to support that community in a really visual and vocal way that is not tokenizing and or being performative? One of the things MCASA started doing a couple of years ago is we worked really hard to get funding so that we could attend Pride events. Previous to the pandemic, we weren't going to Prides. And now we go to multiple Pride events. We have special swag that we take to Pride. We really try to be there in an appropriate way at that celebration each June. And now we do some in the fall too. So for the organizational level, so this is sometimes called the institutional level, you're looking at the environment and social institutions. So think about, do you have ways to communicate with anyone that comes in your door? Do people know what to expect when they come in your door? Like, what's your organization doing as a whole to be inclusive? Gathering data about who you serve and gathering data on a national level. Are you reaching everyone in your community? Look at your hiring practices. Look at your paperwork and your forms. Be clear about your organization's limitations and work to improve services and break down barriers. Your policies and procedures name different identities. Are they on your website? What does your physical space look like? Is that inclusive to people that may have disabilities or sensory issues? What's your website look like? Does it have a universal design? What's the color contrast? Can it be read by a screen reader? Think about all of those things that your organization can do to better serve survivors. And we have two more here to look at the community and policy levels. So community is cultural values, norms, and relationships between those organizations. So we're thinking about cities, neighborhoods, and the resources available in those spaces. So are you doing outreach to different communities? Are you collaborating with other organizations and building relationships so that you're sharing knowledge and information and resources? Are there transportation offices available to your office? And if not, what are you doing to make your resources more accessible for those that don't have transportation? Are you working with local offices to advocate for inclusive services beyond your organization? Are you working with local officials to make sure that you're advocating for inclusive laws and inclusive spaces in your community? And then public policy, this is something that MCASA does a lot of. We work with state and federal and sometimes local laws and those regulations. So examples of how to improve in this policy area is make sure you're voting, encourage other people to vote. As nonprofits, we cannot tell people who to vote for, but we can encourage people to vote for folks that will support what they need. Advocating for legislation that supports survivors, that's something that's right in MCASA's mission. And we try to help other folks with being able to do that. If you work in an organization that supports students, what does that institution do as far as their policies and procedures go? So what are their student code of conduct? What are the procedures of reporting, or what happens if a student does report a sexual assault? So making sure those policies are inclusive of all survivors. And building relationships with your elected officials in your community can also help in that policy realm. So our last slide and our last minute here is really talking about equity. So the image on the slide is a comparison of the difference between equality and equity. So you'll see on the top line, this is equality. Everybody gets the same bike, but you can immediately see how that same bike does not serve everyone. And
Stephanie, sorry,
equity, yep.
Stephanie, you just have to switch the slide. We can't see
Oh,
the
right, I
bikes.
do. I do. Sorry. Yeah, now you can see the bikes. That must have been really confusing there for a minute. Thanks, Alyssa. So on that top line, like you can see, everyone gets the same bike, and that's not serving everyone. But equity is when everyone gets a bike that helps them. So we're not one size fits all, folks. So you may be thinking, we've done the same thing for years and it seems like it's working, but who is it working for? Are you giving everyone the same bike? Or are you serving survivors the way they need to be served when they come in your door? So when you think about, are your services equitable, or are they equal, or are they promoting equality, or are they promoting equity? This is a way to think about that. Are we giving everyone the same bike? We're giving everyone the same services, or are services customized to fit the needs of our survivors? So I feel like that is a good note to end on. I do want to run through these last few slides in our last few seconds. You will get this PowerPoint, so you will get to see some of these organizations that are specific to underserved populations. So organizations like Dawn and Free State Justice, the Safe Sister Circle, the Human Trafficking Prevention Project. These are all organizations that we work with that really help underserved survivors, and they have specialized services. We also have a whole list of supplemental learning if you have questions or you want to learn a little bit more about some of the topics that we talked about today. So with that, I will turn it back over to Alyssa for our closeout, and just hope that you all Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you. So I just put the evaluation link into the chat. Again, we greatly appreciate all feedback as we are constantly striving to improve. If you are seeking a certificate of attendance, you must complete the evaluation form in order to gain access to the certificate request form. You can expect to receive a follow-up email later today with a copy of the video recording, the PowerPoint slides, the toolkit that I mentioned, as well as the evaluation link. So thank you all again for coming today, and we hope to see you tomorrow for the next session in the series.